All right, we're going to get started. We are about 6:31. So welcome everybody. My name is Carol Bowie Jackson, and I'm with Habitat and Wildlife Keepers, also known as HAWK. And just in case there are some folks joining us who are outside of our listening area, one thing that COVID has done for us this year, I know it's messed up the year for a lot of us, but it's also created some opportunities to allow us to get really creative. And how are we going to reach our membership and continue our wonderful HAWK meetings? And we are entering our 15th year of HAWK meetings, and we are celebrating with a new logo up in the right left-hand corner of your screen. So we're excited about that. We're excited to bring you tonight David Mizejewski. He hails from Washington, D.C. area. He's the spokesperson for the National Wildlife Federation. And what this pandemic has done for us is that it's opened up some possibilities in getting people and speakers for HAWK that we may not have been able to get otherwise. Everyone's getting much more used to virtual meetings. And so we're going to, we're hopefully bringing you some exciting meetings and topics from across the nation. And this is our first national meeting. We've got a lot of people from across the country who've joined us by way of the Gardening for Wildlife Facebook page. So we want to welcome everybody to us. The Habitat and Wildlife Keepers is a chapter of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. And the North Carolina Wildlife Federation is the state affiliate of the National Wildlife Federation. Habitat and Wildlife Keepers is based in the town of Matthews, North Carolina, which is a suburb of the greater Charlotte area. And we're also co-hosting tonight with our sister chapter, the Concord Wildlife Alliance. So we want to welcome everybody. I've had the privilege of being able to serve on the boards of HAWK, the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, and the National Wildlife Federation, and I can vouch for the commitment of all of those organizations to preserving and restoring wildlife habitat. And I hope that no matter who you are and where you are tonight, that you will consider supporting at least one of those organizations. As I said earlier, tonight we welcome David Mizejewski of the National Wildlife Federation. David is the author of the book, Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. And he's going to be talking tonight about what happens if you don't have the Snow White-esque backyard where everybody gets along and only the critters come that you want to come. So he's going to give us a great presentation. And while I've got everybody's attention, I also want to tell you that in October, we are going to be hosting Doug Tallamy, Dr. Doug Tallamy of Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope. That meeting will be October 6th at 6:30, and we hope that no matter where you are in the country, that you can join us for that one. If you want to join our newsletter and get our email notifications of our meeting and other events, you can send us an email at hawkncwf@gmail.com, or you can go to our Facebook page on Facebook, obviously, or go to our website, hawkncwf.org. And again, the Wildlife Federation, North Carolina Wildlife Federation, can be found at ncwf.org, and National Wildlife Federation can be found at nwf.org. Everybody is going to be muted tonight. We are going to have a question and answer session after Dave's presentation. So if you want to use the chat feature on the computer to submit your questions, we've got moderators that are standing by to make sure that we get those questions to Dave at the end of his presentation, so he will be able to answer them. So thank you again for joining us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dave Mizejewski. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks so much, Carol. So I'm going to put my video on here. I think you guys should be able to see me. And I'm going to click over real quick to share my presentation. And so that means, Carol, I'm going to take over here. So bear with me for 1 second as we deal with Zoom. Okay, so you guys should all see my home screen here. So thank you, first of all, for inviting me to speak to you guys tonight. As Carol said, the pandemic has given us a little bit of a nudge to figure out how we can do these virtual talks. And, you know, in a way, it's a silver lining because it's allowing us to reach lots of people that we might not otherwise get a chance to chat with about wildlife. And in my book, that's always a good thing. So my talk tonight is called Living with Wildlife, Overcoming Our Fear of Bees, Snakes, and Other Wildlife Neighbors. And I'm going to talk about bees and snakes. I'm going to talk about a bunch of other animals too that you might actually be afraid of and that you might want to not have around. And hopefully by the end, I'll have changed your mind about that just a little bit. So again, by way of introduction, my name is David Mizejewski. I'm a naturalist with the National Wildlife Federation, as Carol mentioned. I'm a naturalist, if you're not familiar with the term, is really just somebody who has an expertise in wildlife and nature, and then helps other people understand those things by educational programs and interpretation and things like that. Now, most naturalists work at nature centers or zoos or national parks. I have the good fortune to do my work at the National Wildlife Federation as a naturalist in the media. So you might have seen me on television. I've hosted series on Animal Planet and on Nat Geo Wild. I'm a regular guest on the Today Show. I used to do the Martha Stewart Show all the time. I do Conan O'Brien, a bunch of other things. So it's kind of awesome, actually, for me that I don't have to travel and go to TV studios to be a naturalist. And I get to do it via Zoom and chat with all of you guys tonight. So I'm very excited about that. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about the National Wildlife Federation. We are one of the oldest and largest wildlife conservation organizations in North America. We've been around since 1936, and we're made up of an affiliation of organizations all around the country, of which North Carolina Wildlife Federation is one. And so this is our mission. It's to unite all Americans to ensure that wildlife thrive in a rapidly changing world. And the sad reality is that we human beings are the main cause of that rapid change. And the news isn't good. Globally, there's over 1 million species that are endangered with extinction right now. And right here in North America, 1/3 of our wildlife species are at increased risk of extinction in the next few decades because of largely our actions. You know, whether it's birds, the North American bird population has plummeted by almost 30%. We've got about 3 billion less birds in North America than we did just 50 years ago. Monarch butterflies, same thing. They're disappearing rapidly. The eastern monarch population has been down as much as 90%. And the western population, west of the Rockies, there's less than 1% of that butterfly population left. I could go on with a lot of bad news, and I'm not here to depress you, but I think it's important to acknowledge that we human beings are having a massive and unfortunately negative impact on our fellow species. And when it comes to what I'm going to talk about tonight, fear of wildlife, that's actually a really significant component in how we've gotten where we are. And so again, my goal tonight is hopefully to change a few opinions about certain wildlife species and encourage us to want to coexist rather than eradicate. So if you're not familiar with the National Wildlife Federation, you might be familiar with Ranger Rick. Ranger Rick is the National Wildlife Federation. We've been publishing Ranger Rick magazine for kids for over 50 years. And in fact, we've actually, in addition to all of the Ranger Rick magazines, we've got a whole line of books. I am actually involved editing those. So if you have kids in your life, check out Ranger Rick. It's a great way to help them get connected with nature. It's a big part of our mission at the National Wildlife Federation. But as you might expect, we do a lot of work protecting wildlife and its habitat, whether it's fighting for strong legislation that protects our wildlife, like the Endangered Species Act, which has given us back the bald eagle, our nation's symbol, which would have gone extinct without it. Right now, we're working on promoting a new piece of legislation called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which is all about using existing dollars to proactively protect species before they even get to the point of needing to be put on the endangered species list. So that's something that we're really passionate about, and we're hoping that you all will support. But we're working to reintroduce bison to their native grassland habitats. We're working out in California to build a major highway overpass outside of Los Angeles for the dwindling mountain lion population and all the other wildlife that gets run over by the busy Los Angeles highways. Back east in North Carolina, we're working with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation to protect the critically endangered red wolf population. So we're working to protect America's waters, whether it's the Great Lakes or the Chesapeake Bay or Puget Sound or the Gulf of Mexico, for wildlife and for people. So we are doing all sorts of wildlife work. We're doing work to connect kids to nature, but you'll notice all those species that I just mentioned are big and furry or feathered. But this is wildlife too. This is that monarch butterfly that I was just talking about. And we tend to not think of insects as wildlife, but they are. They're animals. And they happen to be the kinds of animals that are most likely probably to show up in our yards and gardens that we might experience. And they count as wildlife. And so that takes me to our Garden for Wildlife program. Carol mentioned this a second ago, but this is a program that we've been doing since 1973 to help people help wildlife literally right outside their door. And lots and lots of species can happily coexist with us. Those songbirds that are declining, the monarch butterflies that are declining, and lots of other wildlife, if we just make a space for them. And so Garden for Wildlife is really about teaching people and hopefully inspiring folks to plant things that are going to support wildlife. And in doing so, if I do it and you do it and the neighbor does it, we can actually exponentially increase habitat for a lot of these species. Now, I'm not going to go into the gory details and the nuts and the bolts of how to create a wildlife garden tonight, but I do have a book. It's called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end. And the National Wildlife Federation's Garden for Wildlife website is filled with information on how to do this. So I really encourage you guys to check it out. And again, I'll come back to this at the very end. But this is what I want to talk about, or what my goal is for tonight. It's to use my knowledge of all sorts of different wildlife to help you overcome your fear. And there's a lot of animals out there that, again, we grow up being taught to fear, or just through our, sort of our cultural perceptions of these animals, that we kind of stereotype them into being something worse than they actually are. And I really believe in this statement. I'm not sure who Philip Yancey is. I just found this quote online, but it kind of fit for what I wanted to do tonight. I think through knowledge, we can help dissolve some fears that maybe are not really warranted. And that's what I really want to do tonight. Now, if you don't remember anything else about what I say tonight, remember this: the golden rules. Because even if you do have fear of certain wild animals that are out there that might, again, show up in your yard or your neighborhood, this golden rule is something to keep in the back of your mind. This is what we teach kids back in my nature center days. When I was teaching kids about nature and wildlife, this is what I would tell them. If you don't ever try to pick up, touch, pet, cuddle, harass, or otherwise mess with wildlife, your chances of being bitten, stung, injured, scratched, whatever, are pretty much zero in almost all cases. So the main message here is to respect wildlife as wild animals. They're not pets. They're not, there for our pleasure and enjoyment to go mess with. They're there because they deserve to exist in their own right as their own species doing their own thing without being harassed by people. And when we respect wildlife in that way, there's really no reason to fear it. So keep that in mind as I talk about all the different species that I'm about to dive into. So I want to start with bees. Bees are probably the first wildlife species, and again, insects or wildlife, that we're taught to fear as kids. And absolutely, bees can sting, at least the females can. And little side note, the reason it's the female bees that sting is that a stinger is actually a modified ovipositor. Now, what's an ovipositor? Ova is either the Greek or the Latin word for egg, and positor kind of means deposit. So the ovipositor on an insect it's the body part that the insect uses to lay eggs. So in bees, this has evolved into a stinger, and bees use that in self-defense. Now, the thing that you want to think about when you're encountering bees, and remember, is that bees are pollinators. Now, pollinators are a group of animals, unrelated species for the most part, that feed on flower nectar. And as they travel from flower to flower, they get dusted in the plant's pollen. and they rub that pollen onto the next flower that they go to. And some of it stays there and it actually fertilizes that next flower, which allows the plant then to reproduce, to form seeds and eventually, you know, nuts and berries and things like that, which are carriers for their seeds. And so through pollination, flowering plants, that's how they reproduce. You know, plants, unlike animals, can't wander around and find a mate. So they've evolved to trick these dumb animals into coming and getting a sweet sip of nectar and then doing the work for them of reproduction. And so pollination is really, really important. Without pollinators, flowering plants couldn't exist. They couldn't reproduce, and they couldn't produce all those foods that are really important for other wildlife species along the food web, including humans. So pollination is one of our most essential ecological functions. And bees are our most important pollinators. Now, there are 20,000 bee species on this planet. Here in North America, we've got about 4,000 or so that are native wild bee species here. And somewhere in the neighborhood of about 85% of all flowering plants rely on animal pollinators in order to successfully, again, be pollinated, reproduce, form seeds, nuts, berries, etc. And that includes a lot of our crops. So again, bees are really, really, really important. Without them, it's not hyperbole to say that life on this planet would come to a screeching halt. So again, as you are faced with a bee and your knee-jerk reaction is to squash it, just remember me talking about pollination and the fact that it's going to be a much better thing if you let that bee go about her business of pollinating. And if you, again, don't get in her way and don't swat at her and don't mess with her, then chances of getting stung are pretty much, you know, very, very low. I can't guarantee that you'll never get stung by a bee, but the risk is fairly low. So in the spirit of, again, sharing knowledge, I want to tell you why everything you know about bees is wrong. Or I should say everything you think you know about bees is wrong. So I mentioned that there's 20,000 species of bees and 4,000 here in North America. I am not counting this gal. This is the honeybee. Now, again, this is the bee that we're first familiar with. It's the bee that we're taught about as children. It's the bee that represents all of bee kind. But the thing is that honeybees are the aberration in the bee world. The things that are attributes of honeybees really don't apply to the majority of bee species on this planet. And here in North America, honeybees aren't really wildlife. They're a domesticated species. They were brought over by European colonists for their agricultural services, for their pollination services, honey production, and beeswax. And to this day, they remain a species that largely is found under human care. Beekeepers basically keep the North American honeybee population going. Yes, there are some feral hives out there, but they're really not wildlife. They're kind of like a cow is to a bison, a honeybee is to a wild bee. And most people don't know anything about our wild native bees, which are also declining. And so I want to just take a second to dispel some of these myths about what bees are and aren't. So first thing we're taught as kids, again, is that bees are black and yellow. Nope. Many of those 20,000 bee species on this planet are not black and yellow. A lot of them are, sure, but these are just a few different examples of what bees look like. And you can see some of these aren't even striped. Many bee species have beautiful metallic coloration, green and blue and black and gold. Some of them are striped, some of them are white and black. So you're probably seeing a lot of these bees in your yard right now and didn't even know that they were bees. So not all bees are black and yellow. Bees don't form hives, and they don't make honey. Now honeybees do that, and some of the other bees that we call social bees do, but the majority of bee species are what we call solitary. So of the 20,000 bee species out there, some 90% of them are solitary nesters that do not form hives. And so they don't make honey because honey is a food source for the hive. And if you don't form a hive, you don't make honey. So the bumblebees, they're social bees. Sweat bees sometimes will form kind of loose, social gatherings. But for the most part, the majority of bees don't form hives. They are nesting in tunnels. And of those bees that are solitary nesters, it's one individual female bee. She finds a tunnel. She will go in there and she'll create a series of egg chambers, and she'll lay an egg in there. She'll provision it with a little ball of nectar and pollen. She'll lay the egg on there and then build a chamber wall. And then she's gone. She doesn't take care of the babies. They hatch, they feed on the nectar and pollen, they pupate, and then usually the next year they emerge as adults and do the cycle all over again. And of those solitary bees, almost 2/3, or 3/4 really, of them are nesting in little tunnels in the ground. The other quarter or so of them are nesting in tunnels in old trees and logs that maybe have termite damage in them, and the termites have bored tunnels, or woodpeckers have drilled in. So again, very, very different from what we think about when we think about bees. Really, really fascinating. And then the other thing is that bees, they're not out there sipping flower from or nectar from every flower out there. In fact, a lot of our wild native bees are what we call pollen specialists, and they require certain native plants that they co-evolve with in order to gather pollen to feed their babies. And without those native plants, they can't survive. Honeybees are generalists. They'll pretty much go to any flowering plant, but a good chunk of our native bees are not, about 1/4 of them. So that becomes really important when you think about what you're going to plant in your garden. And this happens to be a squash bee. And the last point I want to make, again, is about the whole stinging thing. So with social bees, they've got a whole hive, they've got a whole bunch of babies, they've got pollen or they've got honey in their hive. They have something to protect. So yes, they might be a little bit more prone to sting if you mess with their hive. But most of these wild native bees that are solitary, like I mentioned, don't take care of their babies. They lay their eggs and then they're gone. And so while the females can sting, it's almost unheard of. And the male squash bee, which can't sting, because again, the males don't lay eggs, they don't have the ovipositor that evolved into the stinger, but the male squash bees sleep inside flower blossoms. So you think of a squash blossom, those big yellow flowers, at nighttime, those bees crawl in there, and then the flower actually closes at night, and they're nice and safe in their little flower bed. And then in the morning, the flowers open and they go about their business trying to find a mate. And so if that cute story does not get you over your fear of bees, I don't know what else I can tell you, but bees are really important. They're really fascinating. They're incredibly diverse. They're declining and they need our help. So why are bees declining? All of these reasons: pesticides, disease, climate change, invasive species, just general habitat loss because we've paved over everything and put lawns out. So the more we can plant native plants that flower that are going to support these bees, the more we allow like a dead log or even a dead standing tree where these bees can nest, the better off they're going to be. Because, for some grim humor, this really is true. As I said, if bees disappear tomorrow, so would we. So we want to do everything we can to promote people having a respect for bees, a healthy respect. You don't want to get stung, but also not a knee-jerk fear reaction that you have to squash the bee, or you have to run screaming and waving your arms, which, by the way, is a good way to get stung. So that's bees. Now, these guys or gals oftentimes get called bees, but they're not. This is a wasp. And interestingly, bees actually evolved from wasps. Bees are kind of wasps' vegetarian descendants, if you will. This is a yellow jacket. Now, just in full disclosure, I am not a fan of yellow jackets because I discovered a couple of years ago that I had a yellow jacket nest in my backyard, and I thought, oh, I'm going to practice what I preach. I'm going to live and let live. I'm not going to mess with it. I'm going to, and sure enough, I got stung, and then I got stung again, and then I got stung again, and I ended up swelling up. I had to, go to the doctor, and now I have to carry an EpiPen because I'm allergic to these guys. So my message here is that, wasps are social, like those social bees. And again, they have a hive that they're protecting, and they do tend to be a little bit aggressive, those social species anyway, like the yellow jacket. Now, yellow jackets typically nest in a hole in the ground or some kind of enclosed space. Sometimes you see them in birdhouses or any kind of covered area, and they will aggressively defend their nest. So the message here is you don't have to go out and nuke your entire property with pesticides just because you see a wasp or a bee. They're doing their business out there, and I'm going to talk about why wasps are important next. But if their nest or hive is not in a place where they're going to come in close contact with you, you should live and let live. Let them go about their business. Now, in my case, that yellow jacket's nest was right next to my deck stairs that I had to go up and down every day. So I stupidly, I put myself at risk, and I should have gotten rid of that sooner than later before it got to something that, was a big hive. And so, I'm here to acknowledge that, yes, you can get stung and some people are allergic, and you do want to factor that in. But for the most part, again, if you follow the golden rule, let wildlife do their thing, including some of these stinging insects, you'll probably be fine. And the rest of what I want to say about wasps is that yellow jackets give the rest of the wasps a bad name because, again, they do tend to be kind of aggressive. But most of our wasps are also solitary. So this is a great golden digger wasp, incredible wasp species, widespread. Wasps are pollinators, just like their bee descendants, many species. They're visiting flowers, they're moving pollen. So that's an important ecological role. Wasps also are predators. And no, this is not a murder hornet. This is a cicada killer. This is one of our native wasps. The murder hornet, I mean, air quotes if you can still see me, is not really found in North America. It's an Asian species. There have been a couple found in Washington State. So if you're anywhere other than Washington State, you don't have murder hornets. You might have these really cool cicada killer wasps that prey on cicadas, as you can see in the picture. They're pretty big and they're kind of intimidating, but they're not going to mess with you if you don't mess with them. So wasps are pollinators just like bees, but unlike bees, they're out there patrolling your yard and your neighborhood, actually taking care of other insects, many of which are pests. So you really want wasps around, as long as, again, it's not a social species that has a hive right next to your front or back door or where your kids play. But if it's out in your property somewhere, just let them do their thing. They're really beneficial. And another way that they're beneficial is that some species are actually parasitic. So this caterpillar, which is devouring someone's tomato plant, has all those little white things on its back. Those are eggs of a braconid wasp, which is a parasite. And it's gruesome. They lay their eggs on these caterpillars, which, by the way, are big, fat, juicy caterpillars that will decimate your tomato plant. But this female wasp comes along and lays her eggs, and the larvae hatch, and they basically eat the caterpillar alive from the inside out. It's just like the movie Alien. And so, if you see this going on, leave the caterpillar, because you want those braconid wasps out in your yard taking care of some of your garden pests. And I'll leave you with this last thought. I'm sure you've all seen those memes where they talk about how wasps are a-holes. I like this cartoon a little bit better. Both bees and wasps are important, and yes, they can sting. But again, follow the golden rule and you'll be pretty okay. And just, practice awareness. If you see these guys or gals flying around, just give them their space. And I can tell you from experience, even though I'm allergic, I am constantly rummaging through my pollinator garden with bees and wasps all around me. And I've never gotten stung. It's only when you approach their nest where they're going to be defensive. All right, let's move on from bees and my big spiel about bees. The next group of animals that I want to talk about are spiders. Yes, spiders they've got those long legs, 8 legs. They've got a whole bunch of eyes. They can be kind of creepy, but spiders really are your friend. If you've watched Charlotte's Web, it's actually based on this species of spider, or read the book Charlotte's Web. This happens to be an Argiope garden spider. Now, these are big spiders. The females get really big, and they can be kind of intimidating. They weave these giant webs. And if you look at this web, you can see that zigzag. So this is why I think, I'm pretty certain anyway, that this is the species that inspired Charlotte's Web. Those spiders actually weave that zigzag in there. It looks like a giant Z. And they do that to give a signal to flying birds so that the birds don't fly through their web that they spent all night building and put a lot of energy and resources into. So it's almost like, spinning letters into the actual web. And I find that completely fascinating. Now, again, this is not a spider that is going to be harmful to you. It's not going to come after you. It's not going to bite you. But what it is going to do is take care of a lot of those flying insects, many of which are pests. So spiders are your friend. And I do want to say that all spiders, or most spiders anyway, there's one group of them that aren't, are venomous. So yes, they have venom, they have fangs, they use that to subdue their prey. most spider species either can't bite, or if they do, it's not a big deal. There are a few dangerous venomous species. The black widow, everybody knows, brown recluse, there's a few species of those. There's a non-native one called the hobo spider. And you hear people all the time, especially online, about being, oh, I was bitten by a spider. The reality is that probably most of those are not spider bites. Most ER doctors are not arachnologists, and they can't really know for sure if something's a spider bite. I'm not saying that if you have a suspicious swelling bite that you shouldn't go to the doctor, but oftentimes it's other reasons, and these spiders get a bad rap. And again, I want to emphasize that your chances of being bitten by those dangerous species are very, very, very low. And going out and wanting to kill spiders en masse on site just because you are afraid of a few of the species that you probably aren't actually encountering is just a little bit out of proportion to the actual danger that you're in. And when you know that spiders are so important and so beneficial, it just helps put it in perspective why we should live and let live with spiders. And some spiders are just so cool. This is a crab spider. Look at how camouflaged that spider is. It's hanging out in the goldenrod. It's waiting for an unsuspecting bee or wasp or other pollinator to come by, and then it's going to clamp those legs shut and get its prey. I just think that's so cool and beautiful and fascinating. I am hoping that you all will go out and inspect your flowers. You might find spiders like this, and you're much more likely to encounter a spider like this than one that could be potentially dangerous. Now, this is a daddy longlegs, and we've all heard the myth, or I blew it. I was gonna hold on to that and reveal it at the end. We've all heard that daddy longlegs are the most venomous spider out there. Well, as I just said, that's a myth. In fact, daddy longlegs aren't actually even true spiders. They are arachnids, but they're a different group. And no, they are not the most venomous species out there. So you can just kind of let them go about their business. And they are important food for lots of other wildlife, including hummingbirds. Love to eat daddy longlegs. So there's a little fun fact for you. All right, so moving out of the invertebrates, let's talk about mammals. Now, for the most part, we kind of have been taught mammals, we don't want them around, we don't want to see them in our yard, they're pests. And no mammal better symbolizes that than our good old trash panda, the North American raccoon. So let's talk about raccoons. I think raccoons are pretty awesome. Now, because they are so common, and because they oftentimes are found in our cities, and they are willing to take advantage of our trash as a food source, they've gotten this bad rap, and again, the whole trash panda thing. But think about this. Raccoons, before European colonization of North America, were not that common. They were found in the sort of the southeastern up into the mid-Atlantic US, mostly in river valleys because they're oftentimes found around water. They like to forage in the water for their food. Since that time, since we have kind of spread and modernized all around the country and radically altered the landscape, raccoons have exponentially grown in population. And they have followed us human beings and have learned and adapted to the ways that we have changed the environment. Now think about how many other wildlife species you can say that about. Most of the time, when we humans come in and radically alter the environment the way that we do, species go extinct, or at least they drastically decline. Not the raccoon. Raccoons are like us. They are innovative, they're intelligent, they're curious, and they'll pretty much eat anything, which is why they've been able to so effectively take advantage, again, of how we human beings have changed the environment. And they're perfectly happy to find shelter in a storm drain. They're perfectly happy to eat your leftovers that are perfectly edible that you've pitched into the trash can. So this is a good example of another kind of, not really a rule, but something that I think is really important to remember. And that's this, that the vast majority of times where we have a conflict with wildlife in and around our homes, it can be solved humanely without even resorting to lethal means by simple behavior changes on our part. So again, with bees and wasps, don't swat at them, and your chances of getting stung, go way down. If we're willing to do that, we can actually help ourselves in the long run. Well, with raccoons, people think they're pests because they get into our trash can. Sometimes they actually get into our houses up and want to, hang out in our attic or our crawl spaces and places like that. So how do you solve that problem? Well, get a trash can with a lid that snaps shut. Put bungee cords on there and wrap them around tight so that even a raccoon can't open it up. Simple, we can all do that. Keep your trash can indoors in your garage or wherever until the morning of trash collection, because raccoons tend to be out more often than not at night. So, you don't have to trap the raccoon, you don't have to shoot the raccoon, you don't have to relocate the raccoon, just do that and you'll pretty much solve that problem. So, same thing with critter proofing your house. We talk about making a home for wildlife and gardening for wildlife and making sure they have habitat. We want wildlife to have a home. We don't want them living in our home. So it's really important to critter proof your house. Once a year, do an assessment. Go around, make sure all your windows have screens in them and that they're not busted through. Check your foundation to see if there's cracks or crevices where animals can get in. Simple things like that can go a long way, and like some caulk, or some screening can really go a long way in preventing these animals from getting themselves into trouble by getting into our house. Now, I talked about feeding the wildlife. That's a big part of the Garden for Wildlife program, providing food sources for wildlife. But what we mean by that is not this. So when we say provide food for wildlife, what we mean is plant native plants that are going to form the foundation of a food web. They're going to provide for, plant-eating animals and insects, which then are going to feed the birds and the small animals and so on and so forth up the food web. What we don't mean is putting out bowls of food for wildlife. This is bad, folks. Don't do this, because as cute as this photo is with all these little baby raccoons munching, looks like cat food or something, the reality is that you're looking at a bunch of dead baby raccoons. A fed mammal is a dead mammal. And it's because these animals, unlike birds, if you put out a bird feeder, that's usually an okay thing to do. But with mammals, they stop eating their natural foods. They start associating people with foods, and they lose their natural fear of us, which can be a really bad scenario. It could be dangerous. If a raccoon isn't afraid of you and he walks up to you, you could get bitten or scratched. So don't do this. Let wildlife be wild. Feed them naturally by planting natives and building up a food web, and don't give them handouts like this. That's another little saying I have, is that wildlife needs habitat, not handouts. One of my favorite animals is next on our list. This is the Virginia opossum, otherwise just known as opossum. And these are such cool animals, you guys, and they get such a bad rap. People hate them. They say, oh, it's just a big rat. Well, no, it's not a rat. Rats are rodents. Possums are marsupials. Now, we are most familiar with marsupials that live in Australia, things like kangaroos and koalas and wombats and Tasmanian devils. A marsupial are a group of mammals that give birth to very premature babies that then have to crawl into the mother's pouch, where they nurse and they grow until they emerge when they're a little bit bigger. And so unlike placental mammals, where that development happens internally, it kind of happens externally in the mother's pouch. Possums are the only North American marsupial that we have. They're special. They're really cool. Similar to raccoons, they're also pretty adaptable because they'll eat just about anything. And so they have also been able to kind of spread their population across North America, which again, I think should be celebrated. Now, I mentioned they'll eat anything. They really will eat anything. And this is why you want them around. Possums will eat any kind of dead animal that they find. They'll scavenge. They eat slugs. They eat rodents. So they actually will help keep the mice and the rat population down if that's an issue where you are. They also will eat venomous snakes, or any snakes really, and they do have a natural immunity to snake venom. So, again, snakes are on my list. We're going to get to them, but, they're a natural check on the snake population. That's a good thing. They also have a natural resistance to the rabies virus. They're one of the only mammals that almost never gets rabies. So that's a good thing. And lastly, recent research has shown that even though, again, they get a bad rap for being gross and dirty animals and they eat trash, possums are actually very fastidious. You know how your cat grooms itself? Possums do the same thing. And in fact, they do it more effectively than most of the other mammals that we call, that are found in and around our communities. And so what happens is when possums, like all of these mammals, get ticks on them, They are such good groomers that they are able to remove almost all of those ticks off of their own body. And they eat them because it's a nice little protein packet. But in doing so, one individual possum can remove 5,000 ticks out of its range, out of its habitat, which is usually, sort of a neighborhood. And that takes them out of the possibility of those ticks getting on you or your pets. So possums, they're unique, they're super helpful and beneficial ecologically. We really want them around. And you know what? Possums, unless you literally go up and stick your finger in its face, they're harmless. They literally play possum. That's where we get that term. If they feel threatened, they're going to play dead. They're going to roll over and their tongue's going to come out of their mouth, and they're going to try to fake you into thinking that they're gross and nasty and dead, and you don't want to mess with them. So they're really great animals to have around. They're not rodents. And so I just, want to make my plea that we should all celebrate possums and not call them gross and dirty rodents. Skunks. Now, yes, skunks can spray, and that is a horrible thing. I personally have never been sprayed. Usually, more often than not, it's your dog that gets sprayed because, we love our pet dogs, but they're not always the brightest. And they will go after and mess with skunks, and then they'll get sprayed. Some dogs don't learn. It happens over and over. So yeah, skunks are pretty neat too. They have this very special adaptation, which is fairly unique, where they can form this chemical spray by glands on their back end. And if something gets too close to them, they're going to nuke it with that spray. And it is really, really foul stuff. So, but just like the possums, skunks are omnivores. So they're out there eating all sorts of things. Again, they're eating slugs, they're eating rodents. They're going to help keep your yard and your garden space actually, free of some of those actual kind of pest species. So again, rule of thumb, don't mess with a skunk. It's hard to miss them. They have that very distinct, bright black and white color pattern that evolved basically to warn things, don't come near me. And as long as you give them their space, a skunk is not going to bother you at all. Again, your dog might not be smart enough to learn how to, avoid the skunk. The whole thing about tomato juice, if you or your dog gets sprayed, that's a myth. It doesn't really work. It might kind of mask the skunk odor. Better is a mixture of dish soap and hydrogen peroxide and vinegar. And if you mix those things together, it foams up and it actually will chemically break down the skunk spray. And it might take a few baths of that, but it'll eventually, sooner than later, get rid of the smell. So again, with skunks, just like with possums, just like with raccoons, don't feed them. If you see them out there in the landscape, just enjoy it. Let them go about their business and you won't have any trouble with them. Foxes. You'd be so surprised how often I hear from people freaking out because they've seen a fox like this red fox in their backyard. Foxes are nothing to worry about. Even though they look bigger than they actually are, the average weight of an adult male red fox, which is the largest fox species that we have, is only about 15 pounds. These guys are like glorified house cats on stilts with big giant puffy tails. So they are naturally feeding on mice, small birds, maybe rabbits, squirrels, which I'm not very sad about as the squirrels have decimated my vegetable garden this year. But they're also eating insects, they're eating fruit, they're eating a lot of plant material actually. These are not animals that are big enough to, try to attack people or pets. I hear people all the time saying, oh, it's gonna come after my cat or my dog. The reality is that I've never heard of any verified instance of a fox actually attacking and killing a cat. In fact, just the opposite. I've seen lots of trail cam footage of foxes and stray cats, scavenging at the same places, and the cats always win out. So again, just like with all those other mammals, as long as you let them be, don't feed them, don't try to get close to them, just sit back and enjoy them. And again, they're playing an important ecological role, keeping those rodents and other things, their populations under control. And they're quite frankly, beautiful, beautiful animals. So that's a red fox. The other fox species that you might see, maybe a little bit less likely to see, is the gray fox. Gray foxes, just like the red fox, are found all across the country. As you can see, they've got a lot of gray in their fur. They do have a lot of red though, and sometimes red foxes have a lot of gray. The way that you tell the difference is that red foxes always have a white tipped tail, and gray foxes always have a black tipped tail. And you can kind of see in the one that you can see the side of, that the base of its tail is getting to that little black tip. But these are even smaller than red foxes, really no danger or threat to people whatsoever. Very shy, very elusive. They are actually one of the, I think maybe the only wild canid species, a member of the dog family, that actually can climb trees. And they routinely will climb trees and go after birds and squirrels and things like that. Really, really cool species, one of my favorites. Nothing to be afraid of. Now, going a little bit higher up on the size spectrum of the wild canid world is this guy. This is a coyote. Now, coyotes are not really a danger to people. There have been some documented, attacks on people, but they're very, very rare. And, really, quite frankly, not anything I would ever worry about. Coyotes are interesting, though, because like the raccoon, they're super adaptable. They have actually expanded their range and have been so successful, even under, 300, 400, 500 years of human campaigns to eradicate them. We have been trying to get rid of coyotes since, again, Europeans have gotten to this continent, and we brought farm animals, and coyotes can sometimes be a problem in with sheep and things like that. But for most of us, we're not sheep farmers in our backyard, and so what happened is that as we wiped out the gray and red wolf populations over the eastern half of the country, coyotes, which traditionally were more found in the West, were able to actually move east and occupy that niche that was left vacant by their larger cousins, the wolves. And the reason they were able to do that, again, is that they're very adaptable, they have a wide diet, and they can handle the stress of living close to humans much better than, say, wolves can. Wolves really need wilderness areas. They're not really found in places that there are a lot of people, not coyotes. In fact, we have coyotes in every one of the lower 48 states now. And in fact, they are found in the middle of cities. The city of Chicago has a very well-studied urban coyote population. And the coyotes, I think there's a population of several thousand of them living within the city limits of Chicago. So really adaptable animal. Again, not really anything you have to worry about yourself in terms of safety. You do have to worry about your small pets, though. Coyotes, again, they're naturally feeding on small to medium-sized mammals. And our small dogs and our house cats, our pet cats, fall into that category, and coyotes will eat them. So if you have coyotes around, you want to keep an eye on your pets. Don't let small dogs roam unattended, especially at night or at dusk. And there are, very sad stories of pets getting eaten by coyotes. So it's up to us to protect our pets and to keep them under our supervision and to make sure that they're safe from wildlife. And again, even if we wanted to get rid of all coyotes, we wouldn't be able to do it. We've been trying, it hasn't worked. So again, we have to focus on keeping our pets safe. And by the way, you really do want to keep your cat indoors. Free roaming house cats, whether they're your pets or whether they're strays or ferals, take an enormous decimating toll on wildlife every year. Over 4 billion birds, up to 4 billion birds every year are unnaturally killed by domesticated cats. And over 20 billion small mammals. And that's billion with a B. These are animals that were brought here by us and unleashed onto the landscape. Many of them are subsidized by humans, unlike wild predators. They're competing with wild predators for the same food sources. So it's a really important thing to keep your cats indoors for the wildlife, but also because indoor cats live on average twice as long as outdoor cats because they're not getting eaten by coyotes or getting into fights with other cats or getting hit by cars. So it's better for the wildlife, better for your cats. Keep those pets indoors. All right, so winding down on the mammals are these guys, bats. So again, bats, we associate them with rabies and vampires and things like that. And again, like most mammals, other than that possum, they can carry rabies, but as long as you don't go and touch a bat, your chances of picking up rabies from them is pretty slim. So in North America, we have 60-something species of bats, and the majority of them are insect eaters. They consume an enormous biomass of insects, many of which are pests, agricultural pests, certain beetles that are crop pests, certain moth caterpillars that are crop pests are kept in check by these bats. And some species actually do eat mosquitoes. In fact, there was a recent study on little brown bats, which are common over most of North America, do indeed eat a good amount of mosquitoes. And so they're helping to keep the checks on mosquitoes right in your own backyard. They're not going to totally eliminate them. You know, sometimes that claim gets overblown, but they're important to have around. And bats, unfortunately, are suffering from a disease called white nose syndrome that has, for the last several years, has really decimated the bat population. We think it was introduced maybe from Europe. The North American bats had no immunity to it. Sound familiar with COVID? And it's actually wiping them out. And in fact, bats are at risk from COVID, from human beings introducing it to them, into the North American populations. So we want to help out the bats. We want to make sure they have a habitat. We don't want to freak out and get out the tennis racket and swat them if we see them. Bats don't get tangled in your hair. That's a total myth. Really, you know, there's no risk of having bats around as long as you don't try to, you know, touch them or pick them up. And even though most of our bat species are insectivores, there are a couple species, if you're watching or listening and happen to be in the Arizona or New Mexico, you might be fortunate enough to see a bat like the lesser long-nosed or the Mexican long-tongue. Those are the two nectar-feeding bats that range up into the desert Southwest. And they're such cool animals. They feed on the flower nectar from cactus and other desert plants, and they are pollinators. So that's pretty neat. And if you live down there, you might even get lucky to see one of them visit your hummingbird feeder to drink the nectar. I mean, I just think that is incredible. And these are really cool animals. They deserve our respect and attention and our protection too. All right, last but not least, I promised you snakes, and we're going to talk about snakes. So snakes, yes, there are venomous species. Your chances of encountering a venomous species of snake are pretty low, even if you live somewhere where they exist. The reality is that almost all snake species are 100% harmless to humans. I'm going to repeat that. Almost all snake species are 100% harmless to people. And snakes are more afraid of us than you are of them. And I know that's hard to believe if you have a snake phobia, but it's true. Even the venomous species are afraid of you. Venom species don't want to bite you. They want to hide from you. They want to use their camouflage. Rattlesnakes will tell you that you're getting too close. They give you a warning. They're like, keep back. I'm afraid of you. Stay away. You know, so the majority of snake species are great to have around, even in your yard. This is an eastern rat snake, one of our most common species, one of the largest species actually that we have. These guys can get well over 6 feet long. They're out there eating, as their name suggests, rodents. They eat birds as well. Completely harmless. If you see a snake like this, please, I beg you, do not fall into that old trap of thinking the only good snake is a dead snake. I'm going to be blunt. That's an ignorant thing to say. And I'm hoping that I can count on all of you to help counter that, because unfortunately, it's still a very common knee-jerk reaction to seeing any snake. Leave snakes alone. They are important prey for lots of animals. Lots of birds eat snakes. Lots of those mammals eat snakes, like I mentioned. They're an important food source. At the same time, snakes are keeping pest populations under control, whether they be rodents or insects. A lot of snakes eat insects. We want them around. They're really, really important. This is a garter snake, probably after something like a rat snake, the most frequently encountered snake species. There's a bunch of different species of garter snakes found across North America. Again, completely harmless to people. Yes, they can bite. It's not going to do anything to you. If you try to pick them up, they'll emit a stinky musk, kind of like a skunk, to say, get away from me. But other than that, they're pretty much harmless. And these guys are eating earthworms, maybe baby rodents. They eat frogs and toads. They're not really anything that you need to worry about or freak out about. I want to note the tongue there. That's the thing that tends to freak people out the most. And that is they think that tongue is going to sting them, or that it's a way that they're going to get, venom out to you. All that snake is doing is smelling the air. I want you all to touch your tongue to the roof of your mouth. Now, if you do that, what's right above your tongue in the roof of your mouth? It's your nostrils. So snakes flick that tongue out, and it's got that forked tongue to have more surface area to gather scent particles out of the air. They bring it back into their mouth, and the roof of their mouth actually is where their scent organ is. It's called a Jacobson's organ. That's all they're doing. So you don't really have to be afraid of most snake species. And again, if you do have venomous snake species that might show up in your neighborhood or in your yard, knowledge is power. Get a field guide. Learn how to identify the different snake species of your area. And if you know that, then you'll know which ones are the ones that you don't have to worry about, and you can just let them go about their business. And ultimately, with snakes, and really all of the animals that I've talked about tonight, we're not born necessarily having a fear or a hatred of these animals. We're taught it. Think about how, when you were a kid, grown-ups acted around some of these animals. Did they panic? Did they freak out? Did they bash it with a shovel? Well, that's where we get it from. So I'm really challenging all of you to try to work through any fear of wildlife that you might have, help spread the information and the message that I've shared with you tonight to your friends and your family and your neighbors. And most importantly, for the next generation, lead by example. Again, I wouldn't recommend picking up a snake, but yeah, I think you get the point here, is that kids are naturally drawn to wildlife, and you want to teach them the golden rule of respect and not handling wildlife and things like that. But kids that don't get to go outside and see and observe and experience nature grow up into adults that don't care about it, or worse, are afraid of it. And that's bad for wildlife. And a little sidebar too, I think we do this in particular with little girls. We teach them, oh, that's gross, and snakes and snails and puppy dog tails are for boys. That's hogwash. Let girls go out and pick up bugs and, experience nature, again, under supervision and that kind of thing, just like with little boys. And there's nothing, innate that makes girls more afraid of these animals than boys are. So with that said, I'm going to finish by saying this. This is the standard in America. In most neighborhoods, even if you don't have a house this big or a lawn this big, giant lawns that don't support anything and maybe a few non-native shrubs is what I see as I travel across the country. And I find this actually, frankly, kind of sad, it kind of makes me angry, because this is a dead zone. This supports literally nothing. Now, what we're hoping at the National Wildlife Federation and at North Carolina Wildlife Federation and Hawk is that we're going to inspire you, through getting over your fear of some of these animals, to go from this to something like this. There's still some lawn there. Lawn's the people habitat. But if we all added some garden beds with a diversity of beautiful native plants, we could really start turning the tide on some of these massive wildlife declines, at least for some of these species that can coexist with us if we just give them some habitat. So it's as simple as providing natural sources of food, water, cover, and places to raise young. This is what the Garden for Wildlife program is all about. Again, I don't have time to go into all of this, but again, check out our website and my book, which I'll share in a couple slides here. When you do that, you can do it anywhere, not just at your home. You can do it at your office space, at the local school, at the library, any place that you can plant, you can create a wildlife habitat to help out all of these great species. And when you do, that's how you earn certified wildlife habitat status for that garden space. And this is just a recognition, it's a reward program, and it really is a way that you can help all of us who work in wildlife conservation spread the word. If you certify your yards or gardens, you can put this sign out and help us get the word out in a grassroots way that wildlife are cool, they're important, we shouldn't fear them, and we can actually help them and coexist with them. So I will leave you with a couple resources. Again, this is our website, nwf.org/garden. We're on social media. These are our Garden for Wildlife social media handles. If you're there, check it out. I actually manage these profiles. So if you're interacting or want questions answered, it's me that's going to be responding to them. But also the National Wildlife Federation and North Carolina Wildlife Federation all have really great social media sites. The National Wildlife Federation has a whole online store. If you want to buy birdhouses or bird baths or other things that will help you kind of enhance your landscape for wildlife. We've also recently launched online apps. I mentioned getting field guides that will help you identify the species where you live. You can now get these apps if you have an iPhone. Fortunately, we don't have them for Android yet, but we're working on that, where you can really kind of search and down to your local area and see what species are around you and learn about them and have photos so you can identify them. So you can check those out in the Apple Store, or just Google NWF Nature Guides and you'll find them. And then lastly, this is my book again. It's called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. It'll tell you everything you need to know about how to create a beautiful wildlife habitat garden that you can coexist with all of your wildlife neighbors in. So with that said, I'm going to stop there. I know I've probably gone a little bit over. I'm happy to hang on and take questions, but again, I hopefully inspired you guys tonight to give up a little bit of that fear of wildlife and make that commitment to make sure that we have a future where we have really beautiful wildlife species all around us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. We do have some questions if you have some time.
I do, yes.
All right, and I'm gonna put my video up there too. All right, so we got a couple of similar questions. From Monty, is there any way to safely discourage spiders from building their webs across windows and doorways?
Well, probably not windows and doorways. You know, and especially at this time of year, the spider population is kind of at its peak. And so, especially at this time of year, and maybe this is why spiders are associated with Halloween. I don't know. I'd have to research that. There's webs everywhere. And usually, again, they're spinning those webs. The Orb Weaver Spiders are the group of spiders that weave that sort of traditional spider web. And yeah, they do want to go somewhere where there's kind of a frame and that kind of thing. What I can say is if it really bothers you, you know, maybe just go out with a broom every day and wipe them away, and eventually the spiders will get the message and go away. I know if you, you know, if you like to go on walks in natural areas, a lot of times they build them across the trail. So that's where your handy hiking stick comes in, and you can just kind of, you know, do this as you walk around. Yeah, it's going to destroy the web, but I'm with you. I don't want to get a spider web over me either. So, you know, in those instances, I think it's okay to get rid of the web.
Yeah, we've all done that dance. And in the same vein, someone asks if there's a spider repellent that's safe to use around water.
You know, I'd have to look up on the efficacy of repellents on spiders. What I can say is this, is that in my experience, a lot of the quote unquote animal repellents, it's complete not true. So, you know, you can buy snake repellents and things like that. I don't think these things actually work. Now, for things like mosquitoes and ticks, there are some things that are repellent that you can, you know, apply to yourself or your clothing or your camping gear. I don't know if those things would be repellent to a spider or not. I'd have to do a little bit more research on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say there's really no reason to want to repel spiders from a natural water feature. I don't know if it's a swimming pool where you're getting lots of spiders, but, you know, again, they're probably not going to bother you. I would, again, encourage you to just sort of take that deep breath, let the spider go about its business. Again, if it really does bother you, get a broom, get a light broom and just sweep them away, and they'll go on to build their web somewhere else.
All right. Elaine just wanted to give a helpful tip with Raccoon about bringing in birds at night so the raccoons can't get to them in the first place. We've also got a question about deer. What do you do about deer?
Now, I didn't put deer in here because most people aren't afraid of deer, but they absolutely fall into that category of animals that, like, you want until you get them, and then you don't want them anymore, right? So, and I could talk for a whole other, you know, presentation about deer. In a nutshell, I wish I had a better solution for you, but there are no such thing as deer-proof plants. Deer will eat pretty much anything if they get hungry enough. Now, that said, they don't like plants that have a lot of scent to them or furry textures, things that are overly thorny. You know, we encourage you to plant natives, but sometimes, you know, if you might need to plant some other things mixed in to keep the deer from you know, things like lamb's ear, they won't eat. Milkweed, they won't eat. That's actually one, because milkweed has the, you know, it's bitter toxins in it. So fill your yard with milkweed. The monarch butterflies will thank you because that's their only caterpillar host plant. Fencing is really your only effective way. I have heard of people using motion detector sprinklers in targeted areas. And so that means, like, when the deer walks up to, like, your vegetable garden or your prize roses or whatever, the motion detector goes off and it shoots the deer with a spray of water, and you kind of you train them to not come close to that area. I think that might be worth trying. You know, and the unfortunate reality is that the white-tailed deer population is way huger than it ever was historically. And so, you know, culling of deer and deer hunting actually help keep those populations down, because we've gotten rid of all of the wolves and mountain lions and bears that naturally would keep those populations in check. So unfortunately, I don't have a better solution than that. Oop, I lost
I'm
you.
muted. Yes, I was muted, sorry. Someone was asking Monty again, do you have a companion book about what to plant to attract wildlife in a wooded or shaded garden?
Yeah, so in my book, I do have plant lists that are, you know, I think would be helpful to you. There are a lot of good resources out there. You know, I would Google, there are some good sort of, you know, shade-loving native plant books out there. Alan Armitage has one that you might want to check out. I'm not sure where you're calling from. I would always recommend contacting your local native plant society. And oftentimes they have plant lists available on their website, or if you know, join and start chatting with folks, they'll have some really good recommendations about that.
And we had someone who's asking why there are so many dragonflies in her yard this year. Is there something special going on with dragonflies?
I don't know, but I would say don't question it, because dragonflies are so cool, and they are actually out there feasting on mosquitoes and things like that. I saw actually in my neighborhood, Carol, I don't know if you know, but I've relocated to New Jersey. I'm not in the Washington, D.C. area anymore, but I was walking my dog the other day and saw a big congregation of dragonflies, and it wasn't where I would have expected them. You know, dragonflies are pretty tied to wetlands. It's where they lay their eggs and where they like to go hunting and things like that. But this was just over a neighbor's, you know, lawn-dominated yard. So I'm not sure what was going on there. But yeah, it could be, you know, in cases like that, usually there's some kind of like micro niche thing going on, like where maybe there was a nest of ants that, you know, flying ants that were taking flight, that drew the dragonflies in, and maybe you didn't notice the ants, or maybe they were mostly gone by the time, you know, you're seeing them. But I wouldn't question it. I would just go with it and enjoy it.
And okay, thank you for that. And any helpful hints about keeping rabbits out of a vegetable garden?
A fence, and like a fine mesh fence. And you want to sink it down. Rabbits, you know, European rabbits are burrowers. North American rabbits really aren't. That doesn't mean they won't try to sneak underneath. So, you know, you could sink, you know, some wire mesh down, you know, a few inches into the ground. And, you know, definitely you want to put it up, I would say at least 3 feet. And that should, for the most part, keep the rabbits out. You could also build, if you have like raised beds, you can do kind of enclosures around them as well. Instead of like, if you don't want to kind of fence in the entire vegetable garden, you can kind of target things like that. And again, the best solution to the bunny problem is to get those foxes and, you know, snakes that are going to eat the baby rabbits and all of that, hawks and that kind of thing. Attract the predators, and they'll keep the prey species under control.
So a well-balanced habitat. Everybody's eating everybody else, right?
Right.
And I've got one last question. Do ants and bees have any sort of symbiotic relationship? Ants and bees.
Ants and bees, no, not to my knowledge. But again, these are incredibly diverse groups of wildlife. Like I said, there's 20,000 bee species. I'm not even sure off the top of my head how many ant species there are. And so as soon as I say, no, they don't, someone's going to Google and find me that one example where there is some kind of symbiotic relationship. I don't think so. I can't think of any specific example of that. However, I did learn something utterly fascinating, and that is that I'm working on an article that is going to come out on the National Wildlife Federation's blog later this week about mosquitoes. And I was going to talk about it in this talk, but I already had too much to talk about. So, but I'm writing this article on the explosion of mosquito residential spraying companies. Yeah. I'm sure you've all seen the signs going up in your neighborhoods too, and it's really troublesome when you know that regardless of what their marketing spiel is, that broadcast spraying of these, you know, insecticides is going to kill other things. And
my favorite excuse is, but it's organic.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Yeah.
We're going to talk all about that in this blog post. So our science fellow who is helping me write this, he's actually diving into the literature so that we can actually have good, solid science-based data, based information when we tell people what these chemicals are and the fact that they are highly toxic to all insects. And so even though EPA regulates them and they're approved for use, does not mean that they're harmless. Organic pesticide is still a pesticide. There might be some benefits over the synthetic stuff, but it's still a pesticide, right? So at any rate, while I was researching that, I learned that there are some mosquito species, and there's 3,500 species of mosquitoes. So they're not all the same. Has learned, well, number one, that mosquitoes actually eat flower nectar, not blood. That's their main food source. It's only the females that want to bite a blood, get a blood meal. And it's only when they're getting ready to lay eggs because they need that boost of protein in order to form the eggs. Otherwise, they're sipping on flower nectar just like a butterfly. And in fact, they are pollinators. There are some orchids that are pollinated only by mosquitoes. So because they like sweet flower nectar, there is at least one species of mosquito that has learned that it can approach ants, which you've probably heard how ants will farm aphids, and then they rub the aphids, and the aphids that suck the plant juices will form a little sugar ball, a sugar droplet called honeydew that the ants then consume because it's filled with calories. These mosquitoes have evolved to go and stick their mouth part into the ant's mouth, and they rub the ant, and the ant regurgitates the honeydew, and they feed on it. I mean, incredible, right? So anyway, I got off on a tangent about mosquitoes there, but
that's very cool. Well, and someone had asked a question about what to do about all the mosquito trucks that are in the businesses that have cropped up. So
yeah, so watch National Wildlife Federation's blog. I'm hoping tomorrow or Thursday to get this out there, and we'll share it on all of our Garden for Wildlife social media channels and things like that. But we really hope that you'll read it and that you'll spread the word in your communities, on your community Facebook groups, and all of that kind of thing, because I see them all over. And in fact, 2 of my neighbors I watched, in consecutive days, the guys come and just literally douse everything. And it just breaks my heart.
Yeah, me too. Well,
we cover those.
Okay. All right. Good. We'll look for that. And we're running out of time, so we're gonna let you go. There are a couple of questions that we didn't get answered, but you answered most of them. So we really appreciate your time tonight. And as usual, you did not disappoint. You always deliver. So thank you so much, David.
You're welcome. And listen, everybody out there, if you want to follow me on my social media pages, you just have to be able to spell my name to find me. But I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions that way.
Okay, and somebody did ask about where to get your book. You can get it on Amazon, and yep. I also think that Hawk may still have some signed copies that when you were here last year that you signed for us. So if they want to contact me or that Hawk email account, I will see if we can hook you up with a signed book.
Perfect. I just put my social media handles in the chat for anybody that wants to grab them.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. And thank you to everybody who joined us. Again, this is a lot of fun to be trying this on Zoom. And so we hope that you will join us for future meetings. Again, want you to support Hawk. We want you to support the North Carolina Wildlife Federation at ncwf.org, and also the National Wildlife Federation at nwf.org. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We appreciate it. And good night. Good night. Good night.